hitting the record button. All right, so we had three breakout room conversation questions on the table. What's the thesis? How is that thesis delivered? Two, what is the significance of the veil that separates the two worlds? And then finally, what are the possible effects of double consciousness? Who would like to share what was talked about in their breakout rooms?
I can go for it.
Right, thank you.
So me, Michael, and Cole were having a conversation about, for the first question anyway, we were talking about how we believe that he was just pretty much saying that you don't necessarily become compliant with American society, but learn to like accept the position you're in and not necessarily, like just let it roll over you, but make the best of your situation. The way I worded it was just like work with the cards you're dealt.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, like he learned that, he had other traits and skills that he was better at. Like for one, I believe he said he was like, he was faster than other kids. But at the same time, it's like, like he didn't get the same opportunities as other kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said that he learned like both sides of it. He had a group, like there was a group of Black people that, just kind of became compliant. Like, oh yeah, this is the way. Like, I'm just destined to be at a lower level in life. And then you had another group who was like, oh, well, like whites are in charge and this is all BS and they're all evil. And so he kind of learned, it's like, I don't necessarily have to become complicit and I don't have to become antagonistic, but at the same time, it's like, I just have to work myself up to a better position.
Great articulation, JW. Thank you. Who else would like to share what was discussed in your breakout room?
I'll go. So I'm glad that JW gave such a good explanation, because me and my group had a really hard time kind of pinning down the thesis.
Okay.
Like my best guess was that the text was really confusing for all of us, but I know the text was talking about like so I'm just trying to see if I'm wrong, like was talking about the part of himself that was that kind of didn't like what he was because of white America saying this is not good who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then the part of himself that was Black and was proud to have his identity. And I thought maybe the text was about reconciling these, like the pressure to be white in white America and the pressure to be authentically Black.
Yeah. Well, Lee, to say that you didn't understand it based on what you said, I don't think that's the truth, right? And I think from what I'm gleaning from your conversation, you really tapped on a very implicit theme within the text, right? And what you're teetering around is this notion of double consciousness. And I'm going to kind of go in great detail about that as I get into my notes. But please remember what Lee just said right now and how he articulated his statement. Jaime, were you going to say something?
Not exactly what Lee said. I was gonna say something like that. That's exactly what I was gonna say.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else want to chime in before we jump into my notes? All right, bet. So just no cap, right? Just to keep it 100 with y'all. Lee is absolutely right. This is a fucking difficult text to read. I believe the first time that I picked the book up, I might have been a senior. I just graduated high school. So I was like transitioning into college. I tried to read the first chapter. It was like, yo, fuck this. I just said, put it back on the shelf, and it sat on the shelf for maybe like 4 or 5 years. When I was doing my undergrad at a HBCU in Tennessee, I picked it back up, I got through a little bit more, but still couldn't really grasp what he was arguing. It wasn't until I started doing my Ph.D. work and I was able to like sit down in a seminar and really break the book apart and have conversations around the book that it started to really make sense to me. So don't feel bad if it seems opaque. It's very difficult. The book was written in published in 1906, right? And a lot of the terminology and the language used is reflective of that time, which makes the text a lot difficult as well. So what I'm gonna do, we're gonna kind of go through my notes, but I'm gonna read a lot from the text and try to demonstrate how to unpack the text, right? So please be patient with me as it pertains to that, because I just want to make sure that you are one, not only understanding the material, but how to engage the material at a level that you're able to walk away with a clear understanding. So again, the book is The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, one thing with this text, the titles are important, right? So we know from the title of the book, he's gonna deal with the souls of a certain people, right? So keep that in mind. And then he has the book kind of broken up, of course, in chapters, right? But each chapter has a specific interest that it's in, right? And so the one that you all read, the chapter is titled Of Our Spiritual Striving, okay? So somebody tell me, what is a striving? What does it mean to be striving for something?
Like working towards.
Yeah. So this is what our spirit is working towards, right? So we know that the text is the souls of Black folks, right? So as a total, in totality, this is what he's dealing with. But for this particular chapter, he's going to talk about what the spirit, what the soul wants, and what the soul is working towards, okay? So to start off, and you know me, you know I'm always interested in that introduction. Between me and the other world, right? So already you know that there's two separate worlds. There is an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, right? So some don't ask the question because they know that this is a delicate subject matter, right? By others, through the difficulty of rightly framing it, right? So others don't ask the question because they don't know how to frame the question properly, okay? All, nevertheless, flutter around it. So everyone kind of dances around this question, right? They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem, right? So that's the real question that they want to ask. All these individuals want to know, how does it feel to be a problem, right? And we know that the problem that they're insinuating is being Black in this country, right? How does that feel is the question, right? But they don't say that. What they say instead, I know an excellent colored doctor, right? I know an excellent colored man in my town. Or I fought at Mechanicsville. Or don't these Southern outrages just make your blood boil, right? So if we were to translate that into our time today, oh man, you know, I love that new Jay-Z album, right? Oh man, one of my best friends are Black, right? Yep, there's microaggression, thank you, Cole. Or, man, you know, I was on the front line with Dr. King, right? This is the way that they will approach you now instead of getting at what they really want to ask you, right? And so what he says is, and this to me, the second portion, you really get to see what Du Bois is about, right? He says, at these questions, I smile, or I'm interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may acquire. What is reducing the boil to a simmer? What is he trying to articulate with that?
Trying to like de-escalate it and just kind of like calm it down.
Calm himself down, right? In other words, these dumbass questions are making me fucking mad, right? I want to bang on y'all for asking these stupid questions, but I'm gonna chill. I'm gonna reduce the boil to the simmer, depending on the occasion, right? Depending on how ridiculous you are with me, I might just bang on you because that's what the occasion requires, but I'll reduce it to the simmer, right? To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word, right? So this is the opening paragraph. This is how he opens up this essay. It's a lot to unpack even in the opening essay. But if you, what I'm trying to demonstrate is you have to section it off, right? You can't take that whole essay and try to digest it, break it into sections, and it'll give you more of an understanding of what Du Bois is getting at, right? So one, you know that he's not even addressing the real question that is being posed to him, or that's not being posed to him, right? Of how does it feel to be a problem? I don't even deal with that. So he says, it's a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the type of world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Continues, one ever feels this two-ness, two warring ideals, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps him from being torn asunder, right? So what he's getting at with this, right? So this double consciousness, and I believe Lee said it spot on, right? It's this idea of being Black in a world that does not appreciate Blackness, right? And you have to kind of bifurcate or compartmentalize how you see yourself juxtaposed to the way that the world sees you, right? And he says that this two-ness that's at play in one Black body, only the strength, what he calls the dogged ruggedness, right? The dogged strength of that Black body is able to hold this two warring ideals together, right? So in other words, the way that the white world sees you and the way that you see yourself is at war within you, right? And it's your strength that's able to maintain and hold this together, right? So what he's really speaking to within that, yes, it's the two-ness, yes, it's the double consciousness, but also implicit in this is the strength that African people must hold to be able to maintain sanity within this war that's internal within you, right? JW, you good, or you have a question? You look a little confused.
No, I just have a headache. So
Okay. Thank you. So on page 9, the third paragraph, DuBois explicitly states the thesis, right? Keep in mind what the title of the chapter is, of our spiritual strivings, right? So I'm looking at, again, page 9, third paragraph. The paragraph starts with this, okay? This then is the end of his striving, right? So this is what we want. This is what our soul desires, to be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture. So let me ask you, what does it mean to be a co-worker?
working alongside other people.
Right. So would you, by and large, right, are the owners of your company that you work for, would you consider them a co-worker?
No.
Nah, right? Because this is a hierarchy there, right? So someone who's your coworker, they're on the lines with you, right? We're the same. So what we want, what our souls desire is to be a co-worker, right? In the kingdom of culture. We want our culture to be valued and appreciated just like all other cultures within the society. Point blank period there, he states very clearly his thesis, right? And you'll know this by being attentive to the title of the chapter, right? Because one, we know that the chapter is titled Of Our Spiritual Strivings. So if he's going to state clearly what the spirit wants, then you know that that's the thesis, right? That's not happenstance that he worded it that way. So this then is the end of his striving, to be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, to escape both death and isolation, to husband and use his best power and his latent genius, right? This is what they want. This is what African people want, according to DuBois, right? Okay. And then he goes on and he talks about, you know, the different ways that African people sought to articulate their freedom, right? First, it was this idea, excuse me. First, it was this idea that the way that we'll get our freedom is the notion of freedom, right? So once enslavement ends, we're free, right? And that's all that African people were focused on, was this idea of freedom. But they get freedom and they realize that they're not as free as they think, right? They're still suffering aspects of oppression. So the next thing that they move to is this idea of voting, right? And he says that the Fifth Amendment gave them this notion, this idea that they can vote. So they place all their energy, effort, and focus on this idea of the vote. right? But then once they got the vote, they realized that that's not also giving them freedom. So we moved to this idea of book learning, right? Education would be the means that they would pursue to achieve their freedom, right? And they also realized that that somewhat fell short, okay? And then they come to the realization, because they achieved their education, that poverty has a very large implication of their oppression, right? And Du Bois articulates, he felt his poverty, excuse me, he felt his poverty. He had entered into competition. Again, think about earlier in the semester when I asked you all, how else can we think about race outside of an identity? And we articulated a competition, right? Du Bois is dealing with this right in the pages of this text, right? He said he had entered into competition with rich, landed, skilled neighbors, right? And he argues to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardship, right? So yeah, I get it, it's hard being poor, right? But to be as a people, as an entire people poor, right? In a place that only recognizes and values capital is the hardest of hardships, right? And to me, I look at, so a great example of this, right, is downtown LA, right? It's one thing to be in poverty, let's just say in a so-called third world country, right? Because all you see is that poverty, right? But in downtown LA, you could turn a corner and you're in vast wealth, right? The cultural confluence of downtown LA, you have hella rich people walking over people who are homeless, right? This is the social makeup of downtown. So what Du Bois is arguing is those who are experiencing that are having a whole different level of hardship because they see what they don't have, right? Then he continues, right? A people thus handicapped ought, anytime that you hear ought as a reader, this is an ethical claim, right? What's gonna follow ought is going to be a claim of ethics. This is how the world should be. If we are to do something ethical, it's gonna be done like this, right? So what he's saying is, a people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world, right? So this is unethical. To ask a people who is steeped in poverty to compete with those who have land, who have skills, who have wealth, that's unethical, right? He said, rather allowed to give all its time and thought to its own social problems, okay? And think about what Du Bois does for a living. He's a scholar, right? The first Black man to graduate from Harvard, right? When he graduated from Harvard, he told Harvard, I assure you, the pleasure was yours, right? In fact, when he comes to Harvard with a master's, they don't accept the master's, so he has to go across seas to Germany and learn in the Frankfurt School, where his contemporaries, where his classmates were Karl Marx, Fred Engels, Max Weber, right? These are his classmates. So very, not even by and large, right? Quite succinctly, Du Bois is the very first person in America to engage in this idea of sociology. So Du Bois is quite literally the father of Western sociology, because while Marx, Weber, and all of them went and did their sociological work in Europe, Du Bois came to Philadelphia and produced the text of Philadelphia Negro, right? So his occupation, right, is to think about the problems of African people. And because of that being his occupation, he realizes, like if we really want to solve this problem, we need to have people who are dedicated to dedicating time and thought to resolving this issue, right? It makes no sense to think that we're just going to come out of enslavement and be able to compete with those who have hundreds of years of head start. We need to take time to contemplate and to think, how can we right this wrong, right? But then he says, nevertheless, out of the evil, right? And the evil is all of the things that they thought would liberate them that did not, right? He says, out of that evil, out of that letdown, came something of good, right? The more careful adjustment of education to real life, the clearer the perception of the Negro social responsibility and the sobering realization of progress, right? So as they started to attune their education to address their everyday realities, they become more clear on the social responsibility of them as a people, right? And then they start to realize how progress can be manifested. And to me, because of my intellectual interest, right? This idea of an education that is applied to real life is in direct alignment with how African people pre-colonization, pre-European contact engaged in the process of education, right? When you learn something, you learn it to apply it to your everyday life, right? That's why when I speak to you all, I want you to think about what your purpose is. So that way, what you do in this academic and in the intellectual space is applied to how you see your purpose in your everyday world, right? This is strictly in alignment with the way that African people approach education. And DuBois is realizing that this is the only way that we could use education as a conduit to give us freedom. He argues that work, culture, liberty, right? All these things, we need them, not singly, right? But together, not successively, but together, each growing and aiding each, right? So we need all these things that African people thought would give them freedom one by one. We need them collectively, right? And this is the only way that we're able to achieve freedom, but they only came to that realization through changing their education so it will fit their everyday needs. I'm going to read the final paragraph. Well, not the final paragraph, but one portion of the top paragraph on page 15, starting with Will. He says, will America be poorer as she replaces her brutal, dyspeptic blundering with lighthearted but determined Negro humility? No, I'm gonna read the whole paragraph so you guys get a clearer picture. So starting on the top of page 15, the sentence that starts with we the darker ones, come even now, not altogether empty-handed. There are today no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negro. There is no true American music with the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. The American fairy tales and folklore are Indian and African. And all in all, we Black men seem the sole oasis of simple faith and reverence in a dusty desert of dollars and smartness. Wow. So he starts off by saying, yo, we bringing something to this country, right? We're bringing things of great value to this country, right? Every day, there's no truer people who embody the Declaration of Independence in African people, right? There's no true American music, no truer American music than those Negro spirituals, those slave songs, right? Because this is the music that America produces. Because of the circumstances that America has placed African people in, it produces this music that we try to use as a conduit to not only save our souls, but literally save our bodies as well, right? There's no truer musical production that's American than that, okay? The American fairy tales, the American folklore, those all derive from the native communities, the indigenous people of the Americas, right? Which we may call Indians, and the African people who were captured and brought here. That's where our folklore and that's where our fairy tales stem from, right? And in all, we Black men seem the sole oasis, right, of simple faith and reverence in a dusty desert of dollars and smartness, right? So in a society that is built around, predicated on money and intelligence to attribute more money, right? African people are the sole oasis in the desert that deals with faith and reverence, right? Again, think about what the title of the book and the title of the chapter is. The soul of Black folks, of our spiritual striving, right? So he's saying, this is what we're bringing to the table to America, right? In a desert full of dollars and intelligence, we're bringing soul, we're bringing spirit, right? Then he asked the question, will America be poorer as she replaces her brutal, dyspeptic blundering with lighthearted but determined Negro humility? Or her coarse and cruel wit with loving, jovial good humor? Or her vulgar music with the soul of the sorrow songs, right? So what he's asking is, what is America really giving up if it allows for our culture to be recognized as a co-worker, right? Will America not be America if that takes place, right? Or in fact, will it be a more authentic depiction of America, right? Will it be a true America that allows for all humanities to have their own place within the society? Because again, the thesis of the text is what? To have our culture recognized in the our culture recognized as a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, right? This is what the desire of this chapter is. So if we have our desires, will America really be different? And this is the question that he kind of leaves us with to close out this chapter. Once you get past the wordiness and the terminology of it, there's a poetry to the writing. It's poetic. It's very well written. DuBois is a brilliant, brilliant scholar, but it requires you to read it a couple times. And the more that you read it, you're able to kind of shift through a lot of the language to get to the essence of what he wants us to get at as readers. Before we jump into Fishbowl, do you all have a better understanding of the chapter now that you've gone through these notes? Yeah, okay. And let this serve as like a template for you all, right? I'm not expecting you to come to class on Monday understanding completely what we covered. That's not the expectation. I come expecting you to have struggled with the material and be open for me to kind of make those clarifications for you, to iron out some of those things that may not seem clear, right? And that's why the question portion of your journal is important, because you could use that to make sure you're gaining a complete understanding of what the material is. So if, for example, after my notes, there's something in your journal questions that doesn't seem, that you don't feel is answered, that would be a perfect opportunity to ask me that question so I can make sure I can clarify that for you, okay? Again, keep in mind, y'all, this is stuff that I read as a PhD student. It's gonna be a little more dense for you all as undergraduate students, and that's okay. I'm doing that on purpose. I'm not expecting you to know everything, but I'm expecting you to struggle with the material. Let's transition into our fishbowl. Do remember that you could talk about my notes, we could talk about your breakout room conversations, or you could use your journals to participate in the fishbowl, or you could even ask a question. That's a sufficient fishbowl participation as well. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl? Okay, got you, Michael. Anyone else? JW, got you too. I believe JW should be done for the semester. I'll double check though. One more, if not, I'll call on somebody at random. All right. Antonia, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yeah, but my internet is kind of unstable, but I could still try.
Yeah, what you can do, Antonia, excuse me. If you're starting to have issues, just put it in the chat and we'll go from there. But
okay.
Yeah. So for today, we'll have Michael, JW, and Antonia. Whoever wants to start, it's on you.
Okay, I'll start. What I wrote in my journal was, I'm sorry about the background noise. I'm outside of Sabaros.
Go for it.
Okay, what I wrote in my journal, what I found interesting was DuBois said that although the slaves were freed centuries ago, they're still captive. And that reminds me of a book that I read by Angela Davis, is The Prison System Obsolete. And it talks about the present industrial system, how it's modern day slavery, and it kind of correlates to all the oppressive systems that are put on people of color, especially Black people, like the gateway to school to prison systems, and all these barriers that help them succeed in life, or like give them advantages like white people have, because although the white people could be convicted of the same crime as a Black person, their sentence will be lighter. That's what I got.
Thank you, Antonia. Great example of an analysis, right? She's taking something from outside of this text and allowing it to make more sense for her. So perfect. Thank you for that. Who's next?
I'll go next. So for me, one big takeaway that I was actually very surprised with was how he kind of had such a broad understanding of the situation he was in, and the fact that he knew that he was already at a disadvantage in life, and that he knew that, you know, just because that African Americans were free from slavery didn't necessarily mean that they were free. He still understood that all the restrictions they had from like Jim Crow laws, and you know, like the fact that they couldn't vote. And then even at that point, he's like, oh, we can vote now. We're still not equal. And in in a time period where a lot of people just had such a hateful stigma towards the other people, towards like, you know, like other races, like whites and all that, he really didn't like, his words didn't come off as hateful. He had aggression in them, but it never came to the point where it's like, you know, like, oh, this is all your fault. He had such a way of using his words to the fact that it's like, you know, it's, again, like I said earlier, like this is your fault, but there's nothing I can do about it now. And so I just have to work and continue to better myself and with the resources I have and the places that I'm in. So that was, to me, that was very inspiring and insightful, because it really showed that, you know, it's not every person of color saw like the situations they were in the same way.
Yeah. Thank you, JW.
All right, solid. I'm actually going to start off with a quote. If you guys want to follow along, it's going to be on page 8. It's going to be in the middle. I'm going to start off with "Alas, with the years." All right, so sorry. Hold on. Alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade. For the world I longed for and all the dazzling opportunities were theirs and not mine. I'd continue, but basically what I wanted to talk about is the term intersectionality. Reading that quote reminded me of this TED Talk that I watched. I'll link it in after my Fishbowl, but it was actually pretty interesting because with DuBois' whole thesis, it's like, yes, that is true with race. Like, or actually, I'm gonna start off with defining what intersectionality is, just for those that don't know. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression. I feel like, yes, in regarding to race, that is DuBois really elevates on that, but I feel like how I could expand on that is that there is a lot of different experiences that everyone's facing. So like in a workplace, there's gender inequality, race inequality, class inequality, some education opportunities that other people don't get. I feel like DuBois really expands upon race, but I really wanted to expand upon like your own identity, our own identity. And it's like, it's pretty interesting, and it just shows how like pretty fucked up the world is. And it's like we all have our own shitty experiences that we all like pretty much just have to deal with. I remember it's pretty much what I talked about in my breakout room, about like we all have our own experiences, not necessarily with race, but like with a bunch of other aspects that are a part of our identity.
You know, that's a really good call out, Michael. And keep in mind, this is done in 1906. And I believe DuBois makes his transition to an ancestor in the 70s. So he lives a very long time, and he produces a lot of material. And one of the things is you can see his intellectual evolution from this text to when he makes his transition. And he begins towards his middle of his intellectual career to start addressing things like intersectionality. So you're kind of attentive to where he goes to later on in his career. And DuBois is a very interesting individual to study, because you see how you don't have to stay intellectually where you start. right? You could allow information and material to expand your perception of the world. And in fact, I would argue that if you're doing true intellectual work, you won't never stay where you started, because if you're not gathering information, it's going to be stagnant like that. So that's a very, very good call out. Thank you for those who fishbowled. What I want to do is kind of situate the remainder of our conversation around this notion of double consciousness. And I want to give you all an assignment to carry forward for this week and this weekend. So this idea of double consciousness and this idea of being able to, or being forced to, I should say, being forced to view the world or view yourself through the lens of the outside world. And this kind of gets to why I asked the question in the breakout room, what are the possible implications of this, right? Has anybody heard of the term code switching? Zuri, can you kind of explain or give an example of what code switching is?
You have your personal life, and then you have your work life. In your personal life, you tend to, you'll use slang, or you can be vulgar at times, but when you go to work, you have to have a certain demeanor about yourself. You might have to dress differently because of I guess a dress code. And you have to just be more professional in that setting, where you wouldn't have to be that way in your personal life. And the same way, you might be different with friends than you are with your family.
Perfect, thank you, Zuri. And another way to think about this term professional, right, is white. So within the Black community, right, we always joke about your work voice. I don't use a work voice. I'm at work right now. How I talk now is how I talk on the weekend, right? But what your work voice may sound like is, I'm Professor Amiri and I want, you know what I mean? Like talking white, right? And this is a byproduct of double consciousness, and it's also a survival mechanism, right? Because let's call it what it is, right? Let's just say I have an interview at a major university, right? My CV is what it is, but I go to the interview, I'm wearing this shirt, right? I go to interview, I'm like, yo, what's up? Whoop-de-whoop, you know what I mean? I go as my chances of getting that job are gonna be a little less likely, and juxtaposed to me coming with a suit and tie on, coming and saying, yes, my name is Professor Amiri and I teach that, right? Because you're gonna have a different response when you do that. So this is why I say this is a survival mechanism, but it's also a way to devalue that natural self that's within you, that true self, that innate self that's within you. And yes, it has grave implications for those in the African community, but I would argue that all communities deal with this that have been marginalized, right? And even for those who occupy white bodies, how this may play out is, well, I'm gonna explain this and I'll go into that. So for those who occupy white bodies, this idea of whiteness is very myopic, right? And I like to emphasize that we should separate the idea of whiteness from people who occupy white bodies, right? Because oftentimes people who occupy white bodies can't live up to the idea of whiteness. James Baldwin does brilliant work around this. He has a book called Giovanni's Room. And the thesis of the book is a white male who is homosexual, right? So that places him a notch outside of this notion of whiteness. Because again, as I say, it's very myopic. It typically is male, it's typically wealthy, right? It's typically Protestant, and it's typically heterosexual. So if you fall outside of those categories, it places you in a further proximity to whiteness, right? This is why I say that even for white people or people who occupy white bodies, trying to ascribe to this notion of whiteness can become difficult, and it could cause you to do these code switching, right? So for example, if someone who is a white individual who identifies as homosexual, it may not be of advantage to you to display that homosexuality because you may witness some forms of oppression. This also goes back to what Michael is talking about with intersectionality, right? So this idea of code switching is pervasive throughout most cultures. So I want you to think about how you code switch, where you code switch, why you code switch. JW?
Yeah, I was actually gonna kind of bring up something relating to what you said, because I'm taking an ethics studies class, and my professor had brought up something called like dominant traits in society. And so what she pointed out was that think of the most dominant person in America, and it's usually a heterosexual white man. And then so she would point out like traits that, like, even though, you know, you're white, let's say a homosexual white man will have a different experience in America. And then she actually had us go through this assignment where it was where it's like compare the dominant traits of like each category. So like the religion, you know, sex, race, like all that. And then it's kind of, you realize where you kind of fall in, and then like in a stereotypical society, like what kind of dominant factors do you have?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, right? And that's spot on, absolutely. Thank you for adding that to the conversation. So let me ask you, and I know Jaime is a little more familiar with this because he had my class before, but think about how you code switch, right? And think about what that feels like, why you do that. Ryan Chin, can you think about or pinpoint aspects in your life where you code switch?
Let's see. Code switch.
Are you multilingual? Do you speak multiple languages?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of like a situation. I guess that'll be in school. That's like the most likely to happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you think you do it in school?
Because when I first got here, like I didn't know any English. Yeah, like it was a struggle.
Yeah.
Like came in fourth grade, like I know a single word. And the funny thing is, the word that I was learning, that was the F word.
Yeah, typically that's not how it works.
And I got in trouble for that. But
so I'm just trying to learn the language. I mean, what you want me to do?
Yeah, I said it straight up to the teacher, and it was like, "Oh, you're not supposed to say that." Yeah.
Great teaching moment.
Yeah.
Sit with that a little bit longer, Ryan.
Okay.
Melanie, how about you? Can you identify or pinpoint when or how you code switch?
Maybe like when I was little, because same with like how Ryan was talking about learning English. When I lived in Boyle Heights, which is mainly a Spanish speaking community. That was my first language. And then when I moved to Whittier, it was mostly like English speakers, and so it was really hard to get into that community, like of speaking English only. Like it was hard for me.
So both y'all talking about how linguistically you are forced to code switch. Absolutely. Cole, can you think about, Cole, a time or how you may code switch? Because to be honest with you, you may not have to. Just to be real, and that's okay too.
Well, I grew up really poor. I grew up on like food stamps. My mom was a waitress, had, you know, deadbeat dad, didn't pay child support. But I grew up in a really wealthy area. And I also have worked in the service industry my whole life. I'm a bartender right now. And as you know, as you work in the service industry, the longer you work in it, you realize where the money is at. And that's like working in like nicer places. So I'm usually trying to find a place where, honestly, where it's like probably more like upper class white clientele, because that's where I'm going to make the most money. And I have to learn, you know, I've had to learn how to, you know, talk about like wine and food that I normally wouldn't have before. And also like talk to people in this like subservient kind of way. And like, so yeah, I've been doing that for, you know, since I've been in the professional workplace.
It's a very, it's astute of you to pick up on that. I'll put it that way. That's a very astute observation. So your homework, right? And
anybody's tall, almost there. Is that?
Okay, your homework. And I say this with caution because I don't want you to get your ass whooped. I don't want you to lose your job, right? But in spaces that you would normally code switch, don't. See what happens. More importantly, be attentive to how you feel when you don't do it, right? Because I would like to serve it as an example. You can live a life where you don't code switch. I don't do that shit. I refuse to do it, right? And I've made a living for myself and my family. And it's something to be said about being able to be yourself all the time. There's a freedom and there's a liberty in that. And DuBois actually argues in the text, right, that we're able to come to this notion of freedom when we are ourselves. This is how he deals with this idea of double consciousness. Fuck that war between the two forces. I'm gonna situate myself in my blackness, and that's what I'm gonna be, right? So whatever that dual identity that's warring within inside of you, listen to the indigenous one, listen to the innate one, right? And allow that to be your dominant voice. But again, don't get your ass whooped. Don't lose your job, right? Like, don't like, yo, I did this assignment, professor, now I don't work at the bar no more. Like, that's not what I'm saying. If you did that, you did it wrong, right? So be wise in the way that you go about it, because I know it's also it's a survival mechanism. And I understand why, as marginalized groups, we do that. Real quick, so the reason why I asked about your midterms, the only reason being, if we have them, as I mentioned, where we prep for the midterm next week and I assign it the week after, you'll also have to come back with reading material, right? So let's just say that you turn in the assignment on Tuesday, right? That Monday or that Wednesday, we would have to have reading material because we can't just have an empty week, right? Juxtaposed to doing it with your spring break. That way you submit the midterm and then just go on spring break, right? Y'all understand what I'm saying as far as the two differences in going about offering the midterm? One, we could do it, so I can be accurate with dates. So one, we could have our midterm review the week of the 7th and the 9th, right? And I would assign you the midterm on the 10th, which you would have to have it due to me by the 15th, right? If we do it that way, when you come back on the 15th, you will have reading material assigned, right? So you're gonna have to do your midterm and read to prepare for that week coming, you feel me? But if we move it back to where it coincides with our spring break, you could do your midterm, submit the midterm, and go on spring break. So those are like our two options, and I'm leaving it to you all to decide which you would rather do. Do you all understand the differences between the two options though? Okay. Show me your hands if you would prefer to have the midterm the week after next. So I'm assuming that no one wants to do that. Give me like a physical representation if you want to have the midterm coincide with your spring break. All right, so that's what we'll do. So let me show you what the reading is for next week. So that way, because we're gonna have to kind of have something to do. So give me 1 second.